a weapon so extreme it fired from one country and struck a city no one could even see. Like and follow if you want more short stories about the strangest weapons in history. In 1918, Germany unveiled one of the most unusual weapons of World War I, the Paris gun. It wasn't designed to destroy armies or break trenches. Its purpose was psychological. Hidden deep behind German lines, this massive cannon could fire shells over 120 kilometers, reaching Paris itself. The shell traveled so high that it briefly entered the stratosphere, where air resistance was minimal. Parisians heard explosions without warning. No planes, no nearby artillery, nothing to see. At first, people thought the city was being attacked from inside. Panic spread faster than any damage the shells caused. The Paris gun was wildly inaccurate, wore out its own barrel after a few shots, and had almost no military value. But it proved something terrifying. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Even far from the front, war could still reach you. It was less a weapon of destruction, and more a message written across the sky. The Paris gun was not a single cannon, but a carefully engineered nightmare. Its barrel was over 34 meters long and had to be mounted on reinforced railway tracks to keep it from collapsing under its own power. Each shell was numbered, and after every shot the barrel slowly widened from extreme heat and pressure. To compensate, the Germans used shells of slightly increasing size, fired in a precise order. One mistake meant the gun could explode. Firing the weapon was a ritual. Crews calculated Earth's rotation, wind layers, air density, and even temperature at different altitudes. A shell took almost 3 minutes to land. By the time it struck Paris, the gun that fired it was already silent. The damage was limited, but the fear was immense. Churches, streets, and homes were hit without warning. On Good Friday, a shell struck the St. Gervais Church during a service, killing dozens of civilians. The psychological impact was far greater than the physical destruction. Allied forces desperately searched for the source, sending aircraft and artillery to hunt a weapon they could neither see nor hear properly. The gun's location remained hidden until the end of the war. When Germany began retreating, the Paris gun was dismantled and destroyed by its own creators. No intact example survives today, but its legacy remained clear. Modern warfare was no longer bound by the front line. The Paris gun didn't change the outcome of the war. It changed how people understood it. The Paris gun fired only a limited number of shells, but every shot was an experiment in pushing physics beyond known limits. No weapon before it had ever fired that high or that far. Engineers later discovered that its shells reached altitudes higher than any aircraft of the era, briefly becoming the highest man-made objects on Earth. The strain was so intense that the barrel had to be relined repeatedly. After around 60 shots, it was considered unusable. The gun consumed enormous resources, skilled engineers, and time, luxuries Germany could no longer afford in 1918. Yet the project continued, driven by obsession rather than strategy. Military leaders slowly realized the truth. Terror alone could not win a war already lost on the ground. The shells did not break morale as expected. Parisians adapted. Life continued. Trains ran. Cafes reopened. Fear faded into routine. But the idea survived. The Paris gun became the blueprint for future long-range weapons. In the next war, its concept evolved into the V-weapons, rockets that no longer needed barrels or railways. The lesson was clear. Technology would increasingly target cities, not soldiers. Today, the Paris gun exists only in fragments, diagrams, and survivor accounts. Yet it marked a turning point. It was the moment warfare stopped respecting distance and began reaching directly for the civilian world. After the war, Allied investigators searched desperately for anything left of the Paris gun. What they found was almost nothing. The Germans had destroyed the barrels, smashed the mounting systems, and dumped critical components into rivers and mines. Only shell fragments and technical notes survived, scattered across archives and memories. The weapon vanished physically, but its influence did not. Ballistics experts studied the shell fragments and were stunned. The grooves cut into the metal showed extreme wear, evidence of forces far beyond normal artillery limits. scientists realized that the gun had unknowingly entered a new scientific domain. For the first time, humans had fired an object into near space, decades before rockets made it routine. The psychological warfare lessons were also carefully examined. Reports showed that terror was strongest during the first days. After that, civilians adapted faster than expected. Shelters were organized, warning systems improved, and the unknown slowly became familiar. The weapon revealed a hard truth. Fear could shock a population, but it could not sustain control over it. Engineers across Europe quietly took notes. France, Britain, and later the United States explored super long-range artillery projects inspired by the Paris gun. Most were eventually abandoned. The costs were enormous, accuracy was poor, and aircraft and missiles were proving more flexible. Still, the obsession with extreme range never truly disappeared. The Paris gun represented a transition point. War was no longer limited by geography or visibility. A city could be attacked without seeing the enemy, without hearing the weapon, without understanding how it was happening. This sense of invisible threat would define much of 20th century warfare. In the end, the gun stands as a contradiction. It was a technical masterpiece and a strategic failure. It pushed science forward while proving that technology alone could not replace human resilience. Long after the last shell fell, the idea it introduced continued to shape how wars were planned, fought, and feared. As decades passed, the Paris gun became less a weapon and more a warning studied in military academies. Strategists pointed to it as an example of how innovation, when driven by desperation, can outrun purpose. Germany invested enormous effort into a machine that impressed engineers but failed commanders. It was a symbol of a nation trying to bend physics itself when time, manpower, and morale were already slipping away. What truly unsettled later generations was not the damage it caused, but what it normalized. Before the Paris gun, cities far from the front believed themselves relatively safe. After it, that illusion was gone. Distance was no longer protection. The civilian population was no longer separate from the battlefield. This shift quietly reshaped military thinking across the world. The gun also exposed the limits of intimidation. Early panic in Paris gave way to grim acceptance. Newspapers continued to print. Schools reopened. The randomness of the strikes made them terrifying, but also impossible to meaningfully respond to. When people realized there was nothing they could do except endure, fear slowly lost its grip. Technologically, the Paris gun stood at the edge of what artillery could achieve. Any further increase in range would require abandoning the cannon altogether. That realization pushed engineers toward rockets, propulsion systems that did not rely on barrels tearing themselves apart. In that sense, the Paris gun was the last breath of an era and the first step into another. Today, it is often overshadowed by later weapons that caused far greater destruction. Yet its importance lies elsewhere. It was the moment warfare crossed an invisible line, proving that science could extend violence beyond sight, sound, and comprehension. The Paris gun did not win battles. It did not change borders, but it permanently changed how humanity understood the reach of war. As decades passed, the Paris gun became less a weapon and more a warning studied in military academies. Strategists pointed to it as an example of how innovation, when driven by desperation, can outrun purpose. Germany invested enormous effort into a machine that impressed engineers but failed commanders. It was a symbol of a nation trying to bend physics itself when time, manpower, and morale were already slipping away. What truly unsettled later generations was not the damage it caused, but what it normalized. Before the Paris gun, cities far from the front believed themselves relatively safe. After it, that illusion was gone. Distance was no longer protection. The civilian population was no longer separate from the battlefield. This shift quietly reshaped military thinking across the world. The gun also exposed the limits of intimidation. Early panic in Paris gave way to grim acceptance. Newspapers continued to print. Schools reopened. The randomness of the strikes made them terrifying, but also impossible to meaningfully respond to. When people realized there was nothing they could do except endure, fear slowly lost its grip. Technologically, the Paris gun stood at the edge of what artillery could achieve. Any further increase in range would require abandoning the cannon altogether. That realization pushed engineers toward rockets, propulsion systems that did not rely on barrels tearing themselves apart. In that sense, the Paris gun was the last breath of an era and the first step into another. Today, it is often overshadowed by later weapons that caused far greater destruction. Yet its importance lies elsewhere. It was the moment warfare crossed an invisible line, proving that science could extend violence beyond sight, sound, and comprehension. The Paris gun did not win battles. It did not change borders, but it permanently changed how humanity understood the reach of war. Long after World War I ended, the Paris gun faded from public memory, but not from the minds of those who studied the future of conflict. It became a quiet reference point whenever new long-range weapons were proposed. Whenever generals claimed a single breakthrough could force an enemy to surrender, historians would point back to 1918 and shake their heads. The gun also revealed a deep imbalance between effort and result. Thousands of hours of precision machining, rare materials, elite engineers, and complex logistics were all concentrated into a weapon that fired only a handful of shells per day. Each shot required recalculation, recalibration, and extreme caution. In contrast, the war it was meant to influence was being decided by exhausted infantry, failing supply lines, and political collapse. Survivors in Paris later described the experience as surreal rather than apocalyptic. There was no warning, no buildup, no visible enemy. One moment the street was calm, the next a distant explosion echoed. People learned to live between impacts, never knowing where the next one would fall. This randomness became the most disturbing aspect. Not destruction, but uncertainty. In this way, the Paris gun foreshadowed modern strategic warfare. The idea that fear could be delivered remotely, impersonally, and without direct confrontation would reappear again and again throughout the century. Missiles, rockets, and later intercontinental weapons all carried the same psychological DNA first demonstrated in 1918. Yet the lesson cut both ways. The gun showed that technology could extend reach but not control outcomes, could frighten but not decide, could impress but not save a failing strategy. Power without purpose became waste. Today, the Paris gun survives only in diagrams, photographs, and fragmented steel displayed behind museum glass. It looks less like a monster and more like a question frozen in metal. How far should innovation go when its goal is fear rather than resolution? In the end, its true legacy is not measured in kilometers or explosions, but in the realization that war, once untethered from distance, would never feel distant again. As scholarship expanded in the late 20th century, historians began to frame the Paris gun as a symptom rather than an anomaly. Germany in 1918 was a nation under blockade, pressure, and dwindling options. Traditional advantages had eroded. In that context, the gun represented a gamble on awe, an attempt to shock reality into changing course. It was not madness. It was desperation shaped by engineering brilliance. The crews who operated the weapon lived in isolation and secrecy. They were artillerymen, machinists, mathematicians, and observers bound together by a machine that tolerated no error. One miscalculation could rupture the barrel. One defect could kill the crew. Their work demanded patience and restraint, firing only when conditions aligned. War, usually chaotic and loud, became quiet and clinical around the Paris gun. What made the weapon especially unsettling was its indifference. It did not aim at troops or factories. It targeted coordinates. The shell did not know whether it would land on stone, steel, or people. This detachment, distance turned into abstraction, would become a defining feature of later conflicts. The Paris gun was among the first weapons to turn war into a matter of calculations rather than confrontation. In cultural memory, it left faint but persistent traces. Writers and journalists of the interwar years referenced invisible guns and unheard attackers. The idea seeped into public consciousness that danger could arrive without warning and without a face. This subtle shift influenced how societies prepared for the next war, building shelters, planning evacuations, and accepting that civilians were now part of the strategic equation. From a scientific perspective, the data gathered from the Paris gun quietly advanced understanding of high-altitude conditions. Pressure, temperature, and drag at extreme heights were measured indirectly through its firings. Though born from violence, the information fed into later research in ballistics and aeronautics. Progress and destruction once again shared the same path. Ultimately, the Paris gun occupies a narrow but important space in history. It was neither decisive nor forgotten. It was a threshold. Before it, war had edges. After it, those edges blurred. The battlefield expanded until it included cities, skies, and eventually continents. The steel is gone. Its echo is not. In the final analysis, the Paris gun forces historians to confront an uncomfortable truth about modern warfare. Once a technology proves something is possible, it cannot be unlearned. Even though the weapon failed strategically, it demonstrated that range, height, and invisibility could be weaponized. From that moment on, restraint was no longer enforced by technical limits, only by choice. Between the world wars, military theorists debated its meaning. Some dismissed it as a curiosity, an expensive stunt. Others saw it as a preview. These debates quietly shaped doctrines that would later justify strategic bombing and long-range strikes. The logic was always similar. If pressure could be applied directly to the heart of a society, resistance might collapse faster. History would repeatedly show how flawed that assumption was. The Paris gun also highlighted a growing separation between those who fought wars and those who suffered them. Its operators never saw Paris. They never saw the results of their calculations. For them, success was measured in data and distance, not in human consequence. This separation would widen dramatically in later decades, as weapons became faster, more remote, and increasingly automated. As time passed, the gun story became less about Germany and more about a global shift. Other nations pursued reach instead of accuracy, shock instead of engagement. The battlefield became abstract, and civilians became statistics. What began as an experiment in artillery quietly contributed to a century defined by long-range threat. Today, when historians look back at World War I, the Paris gun stands apart from trenches, gas, and massed infantry. It does not fit the image of the war most people recognize. That is precisely why it matters. It did not belong to its time. It belonged to the future. In that sense, the Paris gun was not just a weapon of the First World War. It was an announcement of the wars to come. The Paris gun was dismantled, buried, and erased, but the idea it introduced could not be destroyed. War had learned how to reach without approaching, how to strike without being seen, how to frighten without engaging. That lesson outlived the weapon itself. What remained was a shift in mindset. Victory was no longer imagined only at the front, but deep behind it. Cities became targets, distance became irrelevant, and technology became a language of threat. The Paris gun proved that once civilians entered the equation, war changed its shape forever. It stands today as a quiet warning from steel and mathematics. Innovation does not choose its purpose, people do. And when fear becomes the goal, the cost is always greater than the damage done. The gun fell silent in 1918. Its consequences never did.